Right now, something you probably consider completely normal was, just a few decades ago, illegal, shameful, or unthinkable to say out loud. Marriages that used to be arranged entirely by parents are now chosen freely by two people who met on an app. Relationships that used to be hidden in secrecy are now openly celebrated in public. Behaviors that once meant total social exile now barely raise an eyebrow at a dinner table. So what changed? Why did human sexuality, one of the oldest and most tightly controlled parts of human life, transform so dramatically and so fast in such a short span of time? By the end of this video, you will understand how 300,000 years of human history, from the earliest tribes wandering the African savanna to the algorithms that now quietly decide who we date, reshape the most private part of our lives into something almost unrecognizable. You will see the turning points, the quiet revolutions, and the surprising reversals that got us here. And by the end, you might ask yourself a genuinely uncomfortable question. Has this change actually made us freer, or has it simply made us different? Trading one set of rules for another we barely notice? Long before written history existed, early Homo sapiens lived in small, mobile bands of roughly 20 to 50 people. In these tight-knit communities, survival depended entirely on cooperation, not privacy. Anthropological studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies suggest that pair bonding did exist, but exclusivity was often loose, and children were frequently raised communally rather than by a single isolated nuclear family. Paternity, in many cases, mattered far less than it would later matter in agricultural societies, simply because resources were shared collectively rather than inherited individually. Marriage, as a formal binding contract, barely existed in this era at all. Instead, relationships were often fluid arrangements shaped by practicality, by alliance building between different families or bands, and by the constant need to maintain group cohesion in a harsh, unpredictable environment. Gender roles certainly existed, but archaeological evidence suggests they were far less rigid than most people assume today. Evidence from tool use, cave art, and burial sites suggests labor was frequently divided by circumstance rather than by strict biological rule. Women hunted small game in some documented societies, and men actively participated in caregiving duties in others. Here is the surprising fact. For roughly 90% of human existence, there was no concept of a nuclear family unit at all as we understand it today. But then everything changed. The agricultural revolution, roughly 10,000 years ago, upended this entire way of life. Once humans settled permanently into farming communities, land ownership, inheritance, and lineage suddenly became critically important. A father needed to know precisely which children were biologically his, so he could pass down land, livestock, and property. This single seismic shift from mobile foraging to settled agriculture is arguably one of the most important sexual turning points in all of human history, because it created the direct incentive for controlling female sexuality, specifically in order to guarantee paternity certainty. Religion soon stepped in to reinforce this brand new social order. Early belief systems began linking fertility itself to sacred ritual, and as organized religions matured over centuries, they codified strict rules around marriage, chastity, and reproduction. The family unit became not just an economic structure, but a moral one, blessed or condemned depending on how closely it matched religious expectation. Sexuality was no longer simply a private, personal act. It became a matter of community law, ancestral duty, and divine judgment, watched over by priests, elders, and eventually entire legal systems. Family expectations shifted alongside all of this. In foraging bands, a child's well-being had been the responsibility of the whole group. Grandmothers, aunts, and unrelated adults all played active roles in raising the next generation. Once farming took hold, however, the household itself became the primary economic unit, and children were increasingly seen as labor and as heirs rather than simply as members of a shared community. Marrying young, marrying within one social class, and producing enough children to work the land became practical necessities rather than personal preferences. And failing to meet these expectations could mean genuine economic hardship for an entire family line. As civilizations grew larger, wealthier, and more complex, informal customs gradually hardened into formal written law. Ancient legal codes, from Mesopotamia to Rome to medieval Europe, contained astonishingly detailed rules about marriage, adultery, and inheritance rights. Marriage, in nearly all of these societies, was rarely about love at all. It was a contract between families, often carefully negotiated to secure political alliances, valuable land, or elevated social status. Divorce, where it existed at all, was usually far easier for men to obtain than for women. And in many societies, women who sought separation risked losing custody of their own children or their entire social standing overnight. Consent, in the modern sense that we understand it today, was a relatively recent concept. For most of recorded history, a woman's consent to marriage was considered secondary to her father's authority, and later her husband's authority, over her body and her choices. Marital rape was not even legally recognized as a crime in many countries until astonishingly recently. Some Western nations did not formally criminalize it until the 1990s, a fact that surprises most people when they first hear it. Birth control has existed in some primitive form for thousands of years, from herbal concoctions used in ancient Egypt to early barrier methods documented in classical Rome, but access was almost always heavily restricted, and effectiveness varied wildly from method to method. Governments and religious authorities frequently viewed birth control with deep suspicion, fearing it would undermine population growth, disrupt labor supply, or erode moral order entirely. In several countries, contraception remained criminalized well into the 20th century, banned outright by law. Same-sex relationships existed across nearly every documented culture throughout history, but their legal and social status varied enormously from place to place. Some ancient societies tolerated or even openly celebrated them in certain specific contexts, while others punished them severely with exile, imprisonment, or death. As monotheistic religions spread and consolidated political power across continents, laws against same-sex relationships became far more common and far more severe, a harsh legal legacy that persisted in many countries all the way until the 21st century. Government policy, in nearly every era, has always shaped sexuality, whether through marriage licensing, age of consent laws, immigration rules tied directly to family structure, or state-sponsored propaganda promoting one particular family model over all others. In authoritarian regimes throughout history, sexuality was frequently treated as a direct matter of state interest, tied to population growth, military strength, or ideological purity. Enforcement of all these rules was rarely even-handed. Village elders, religious courts, and later state institutions monitored behavior far more closely for women than for men, and the punishments handed down for the exact same offense frequently differed enormously depending on gender, class, and wealth. A wealthy man's affair might be quietly overlooked or explained away, while a poor woman's single indiscretion could end in public humiliation, banishment, or worse. This uneven enforcement created a strange, uncomfortable gap between the law as it was written and the law as it was actually applied in daily life. But laws are only half the story. What people actually did behind closed doors was often a completely different picture. Laws and religious doctrine tell us what societies claim to value publicly, but they rarely tell us what people actually did privately behind closed doors. Historical letters, private diaries, court records, and medical case files reveal a dramatically different picture than official public morality ever suggested. Dating, as a concept, is remarkably recent in human history. For most of the past, courtship was a supervised, semi-public process, almost always taking place in the presence of chaperones, family members, or entire watching communities. Young people typically met potential partners at church gatherings, community dances, or through introductions carefully arranged by relatives. The very idea of two people going out alone together, completely unsupervised, to get to know one another romantically, did not become socially acceptable in the West until the early 20th century. And even then, it remained deeply controversial for years. Public opinion and private behavior often diverged sharply, sometimes shockingly so. Victorian England, frequently remembered today as a period of extreme sexual repression, also had a thriving underground culture of secret affairs and a booming, lucrative market for erotic literature and photography, alongside widespread prostitution in nearly every major city. Historians estimate that in some major 19th century cities, a genuinely significant percentage of adult men had visited a prostitute at least once, despite the intense public shame publicly associated with sexuality during that exact same period. The gap between elite and common experience was often stark and deeply unfair. Wealthy and aristocratic classes frequently enjoyed far more personal flexibility, arranging discreet affairs, mistresses, or entirely unconventional living arrangements, all protected by their social standing and their considerable financial resources. Ordinary working people faced far harsher consequences for the exact same behavior, since they simply lacked the money or influence needed to shield themselves from public scandal, legal punishment, or complete social exile. Hidden realities also included widespread but entirely unspoken same-sex relationships, small cross-dressing communities in certain progressive cities, and complex family structures that never once appeared in any official record. Many of these rich histories were deliberately erased, destroyed, or hidden away by families deeply ashamed of what official society condemned, meaning much of this history has only been carefully reconstructed in recent decades through painstaking archival research, careful interpretation of coded personal letters, and quiet oral testimony passed down within families willing to finally speak about it. If there is one single period that changed absolutely everything, it is the powerful collision of several massive forces across the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. The Industrial Revolution pulled millions upon millions of people, away from small, tightly supervised agricultural communities and into large, anonymous, sprawling cities. This new anonymity was quietly revolutionary. For the very first time in human history, large numbers of ordinary people could live independently from their extended families, entirely outside the constant social supervision that had regulated behavior for thousands upon thousands of years. Urban life created entirely new possibilities almost overnight. Young men and women now worked in factories alongside total strangers, lived in boarding houses far away from any parental oversight, and had disposable income of their own for the very first time. Courtship began shifting rapidly from a family-supervised institution into something individuals increasingly controlled entirely by themselves. But it was the fight for women's rights that added the truly enormous momentum. As women gradually gained the right to vote, to own property, to work outside the home, and eventually to control their own reproductive choices, the entire foundation of traditional sexual control began to visibly crumble. Legal reforms throughout the 20th century expanded access to divorce, criminalized marital violence for the first time, and slowly recognized women as full legal individuals rather than property simply transferred from father to husband. Then came the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 1970s, arguably the single most concentrated period of change in the entire recorded history of human sexuality. The introduction of the birth control pill gave women unprecedented, reliable control over their own reproduction, separating sex from pregnancy in a way that had genuinely never been possible before in human history. Feminist movements directly challenged traditional expectations around marriage and monogamy. Public attitudes toward premarital relationships, cohabitation, and divorce shifted dramatically within a single generation, something that would have seemed utterly impossible only a few decades earlier. Lekin asli turning point abhi na baki tha. And then the internet arrived, and everything accelerated again, faster than anyone could have predicted. Suddenly, information about relationships and identity that had once been locked away in restricted medical textbooks or exchanged only in whispered private conversations became instantly searchable by anyone, anywhere. People could finally find communities of others who shared their experiences, no matter how isolated they felt in their immediate physical surroundings. Legal reforms followed, often decades behind rapidly changing public attitudes, as courts and legislatures worldwide gradually extended rights to same-sex couples, decriminalized private consensual acts between adults, and recognized a far broader range of family structures than ever before in recorded history. It is worth noting that none of this unfolded evenly around the world. While Western nations experienced these shifts across a roughly 200-year window, other regions moved on very different timelines entirely, shaped by their own colonial histories, religious traditions, and economic development. Some countries adopted women's suffrage and liberalized divorce laws decades before others did, while some conservative societies deliberately resisted these changes altogether, viewing them as a direct threat to cultural or religious identity. This means that, even today, describing a single global timeline of sexual liberation is somewhat misleading. It would be more accurate to say that dozens of separate, overlapping revolutions occurred, each on its own schedule, each shaped by its own local history. Media has always powerfully shaped how ordinary people think about relationships, but its influence multiplied enormously over the course of the last century alone. Early cinema, back in its silent era, was surprisingly bold, openly depicting affairs, seduction, and moral ambiguity on screen for mass audiences. This provoked a fierce public backlash, leading to strict content codes across Hollywood that limited on-screen intimacy, forbade certain depictions considered controversial at the time, and even required married couples to be shown sleeping in separate beds. Television eventually brought relationships directly into the family living room, gradually normalizing depictions of dating, romance, and eventually far more complex relationship structures that earlier generations rarely saw represented at all. Music has always carried romantic and suggestive undertones, from coded, careful lyrics in the early 20th century to the far more direct and explicit content of modern popular music, with each new generation pushing boundaries that the previous generation considered genuinely shocking. Magazines played an enormous role in shaping mid-20th century public attitudes, with some publications directly challenging conservative norms by publishing frank, honest discussions of desire, pleasure, and relationships that mainstream publishers had always refused to touch. This sparked intense, ongoing cultural debate about morality, exploitation, and freedom of expression that continues in different forms even today. But then the internet transformed everything all over again. Access to information, entire communities, and content became instant and largely anonymous for the very first time. Social media platforms created new pressures and new freedoms simultaneously, allowing people to express identities that would have been genuinely dangerous to reveal publicly in earlier decades, while also creating entirely new forms of judgment, comparison, and constant public scrutiny. Dating apps represent perhaps the most significant recent shift of all. For the first time in human history, finding a romantic partner does not require any shared physical community, workplace, family network, or social circle whatsoever. Algorithms now quietly mediate introductions that used to depend entirely on geographic proximity and social overlap, fundamentally changing how relationships begin, how they develop, and how quickly they can end. Today, attitudes toward relationships and family life vary enormously depending on culture, religion, and geography, but several broad global trends remain clearly visible. Marriage rates have declined steadily in many developed countries, while the average age of first marriage has risen substantially compared to just a few decades ago. Cohabitation before marriage, once heavily stigmatized and even legally restricted, is now common and largely unremarkable across much of the world today. Dating culture has fragmented into countless distinct subcultures and expectations, shaped heavily by ever-evolving technology. Casual dating, long-term partnerships without formal marriage, and entirely new relationship structures all coexist alongside more traditional models, often within the exact same communities and even within the same families. LGBTQ+ rights have expanded dramatically in many countries over just the past few decades, with same-sex marriage now legally recognized in a rapidly growing number of nations, alongside much broader legal protections against discrimination. However, this progress remains deeply uneven globally, with some countries steadily moving toward greater acceptance, while others maintain severe restrictions or harsh criminal penalties. Birth rates have declined sharply across most developed nations. A striking trend demographers link to numerous overlapping factors, including shifting career priorities, financial pressures, changing attitudes toward ideal family size, and far greater individual autonomy over major life choices. Public opinion on these deeply personal topics remains sharply divided along generational, religious, and political lines, even within the exact same countries, creating ongoing cultural and political tension around issues that previous generations rarely debated openly at all. It is a strange irony that, even as information about relationships has never been more freely available, many people report feeling more confused and more anxious about dating than previous generations ever did. Surveys in several countries suggest younger adults are having fewer casual encounters and forming fewer long-term partnerships at the same age their parents did, even as public discussion of sexuality has become far more open than ever before. Some researchers point to rising economic pressures, delayed financial independence, and the sheer overwhelm of endless choice offered by modern dating apps as possible explanations for this, while others argue instead that young people today are simply being far more deliberate and selective than earlier generations were ever forced to be. Looking ahead, emerging technologies promise to reshape human relationships once again, perhaps even more radically than before. Artificial intelligence is already being used to power sophisticated matchmaking algorithms, and increasingly advanced AI companions are raising entirely new questions about the boundary between human and artificial connection. Some researchers predict a growing number of people will form genuinely meaningful emotional bonds with AI systems designed specifically for companionship, a possibility that seemed like pure science fiction only a single decade ago. Virtual and augmented reality technologies may soon create entirely new categories of connection that do not fit neatly into any historical definition of relationships at all. Demographic changes, including rapidly aging populations in many developed countries alongside declining birth rates, will likely continue reshaping government policy around family structure, immigration, and broader social support systems for decades to come. Alongside all of these fast-moving possibilities also come genuine open questions and very real concerns worth taking seriously. Will constant digital connection actually make people feel closer? Or will it leave many people feeling more isolated than any generation before them, surrounded by contact but starved of real intimacy? Will artificial companionship genuinely supplement human relationships, or will it slowly and quietly begin to replace them entirely for a meaningful share of the population? Policymakers, researchers, and ordinary families around the world are already grappling openly with these difficult questions, and there are no easy, universally agreed-upon answers yet available. Only competing predictions and early, incomplete evidence to work from. Predicting the future of something as deeply personal and culturally variable as human relationships is inherently uncertain. But the consistent pattern of the last 300,000 years suggests one unavoidable truth. Whatever feels permanent, obvious, and natural today will almost certainly look strange, quaint, or even shocking to future generations, exactly the same way many past norms now seem shocking to us. We have traveled an extraordinary distance, from small foraging bands with fluid, communal relationships, through millennia of strict religious and legal control designed specifically to secure inheritance and lineage, through industrial cities that quietly dismantled centuries of traditional supervision, through a revolution that finally separated reproduction from intimacy, and into a digital age where algorithms now quietly shape our most personal choices. Then and now could hardly look more different. What was once hidden away in shame is now discussed openly in public. What was once tightly controlled by family and religious authority is now, in many parts of the world, a genuinely free individual choice. What was once dangerous to even reveal is now, for many people, a proud source of identity. So here's the real question worth sitting with. Has this transformation made us genuinely freer and happier, or did something valuable quietly get lost along the way? Some sense of commitment, community, or shared meaning that earlier generations, for all their obvious restrictions, actually possessed? History rarely offers a clean, comfortable answer to a question like this, and perhaps that discomfort itself is the real lesson every generation eventually has to face on its own terms. What do you think? Was this change good for society overall, or did we lose something important in the process along the way? Let me know your honest thoughts in the comments below, and thank you for watching all the way to the end.